I mean, David Dimbleby gave a lecture last year, I think it was, after the funeral. He was criticising the BBC for being too close to the royal family. And when they were filming the funeral, they were getting minute by minute emails coming from the palace saying, that bit of footage you can't use again, that bit of footage don't show again, you know, and the BBC just goes along with them.
Wow.
You know, say, and
that is not a public service broadcaster.
No,
that is not a public service broadcaster. Does not behave like that.
No.
Should Britain be a monarchy? Should it have a king or queen at the top of its political and social order? It's a hugely controversial question which triggers powerful emotions, especially for those who view the royal family as synonymous with all that is best about Britain. But a growing minority has not only reservations about the Windsors, but think they shouldn't play a role in Britain's future. Recent polling found that 25% of people would now like to see the monarchy abolished, a rise of 10% in just 5 years. Of course, that's far from a majority, but it's millions of people who are barely acknowledged, let alone reflected in the national conversation. So should we get rid of the royals? And what are the arguments for becoming a republic? With me to discuss that today is Graham Smith, CEO of Republic, a British Republican pressure group advocating the replacement of the monarchy with a parliamentary republic. Graham Smith, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you.
Have you always been a Republican?
Yeah, I've always instinctively been a Republican. I remember in 1986, I was 12 years old when they had the Sarah Ferguson wedding. The school wanted to bring the TV into the classroom so we could watch it, and I wanted to go outside into the playground. So it's something that I've always instinctively felt.
And your parents, were they Republicans?
Yeah, my parents have always been Republican. I remember my dad saying that he was probably a similar age, probably about 10 or 11 when he saw the King visit, and that was the moment he realised he didn't like the monarchy. But they didn't instill it in me. They just kind of allowed us to make up our own mind. And I think when you're a kid, there's that sort of basic childish kind of notion of fairness, which sticks with you. And then when you learn, as you get older, more about it, it makes even less sense.
So your parents must have been quite, strange is a bit of a harsh word, but unusual, because even if it's a minority pursuit today, republicanism is a much bigger strain within public life than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, but I think it's always been a reasonably substantial minority. But yeah, I think it was probably, it wasn't something that was really talked about, and it was certainly more difficult 30 years ago to have a sensible conversation about it. So yeah, unusual. I think, they were both Labour members, and they're both, on the right side of a lot of issues. I think for them as well, it was just instinctive.
So sort of CND sort of peace activist people, or
not really, no. But I mean, just sort of fairly run of the mill sort of voters, really. That just
progressives.
Yeah, progressive, definitely. Yeah,
because it's an interesting one, isn't it? That although the UK in the 20th century had a really large, successful Labour movement, you can look at socialists like Clement Attlee or Nye Bevan, and actually, they were making arguments, well, particularly Attlee, making arguments for constitutional monarchy. So this idea that you're on the left of the economic debate and that you're also a Republican, that's intuitive for many people in Europe, but in Britain it's not the case.
Well, I think there's people on the left in Europe that have, where the monarchy survives, people on the left have also argued for it. And part of it, I think, is a kind of, there's a reluctance to get into big constitutional change. Part of it is that the way our constitution is set up now gives the government an awful lot of power, and that is always helpful to any prime minister, whichever party they're in. So rocking that boat is not necessarily in their interests. I also think that with the Cold War probably sharpened divisions, and that became sort of a potential symbol of division that they didn't want to get involved with. So I think there were sharper attacks against the left from the right in terms of communism and so on. So maybe that, I think, probably delayed a serious conversation about the monarchy. But, it did come up and get discussed from time to time, but the really vocal Republicans were pretty few and far between.
So why do you want to end the British monarchy? What's it done to you, Graham?
Well, same as it does
it's your job. I mean, you must care so deeply about it.
Same it does to all of us. I mean, there's a few basic points. The first one is just a matter of principle. We are Democrats in this country. Most of us, the vast majority of us, believe in democracy. Increasingly, most of us, I think, don't necessarily believe in the British variant of democracy. We have a lot of problems with a whole raft of issues such as the electoral system, the way the House of Commons works, the House of Lords, and all the rest of it. But the Crown is at the centre of that, and the monarchy is at the centre of that. And Democrats should not be supporting an institution that rests on an entirely different set of values, which is sort of feudal values of bloodline, elitism, exceptionalism, and that should be enough for most people. But if you're not that convinced about the principle, the institution itself is not fit for purpose. It is not going too far to say that it's corrupt, which is not about criminal or illegal behaviour. It's about sort of abuse of public office in terms of public money, abuse through lobbying behind closed doors. And there's a whole raft of issues in the way in which that institution operates. Not to mention the family themselves, who are not people we would vote for if we had a free and fair election. But then the Crown itself, you've got the principle in the palace, but the Constitution itself is pretty awful. I mean, some people like to think that we've got this Constitution, the mother of parliaments, which is envied around the world, and it isn't. Most countries that have parliamentary democracies do it better than we do. And the Crown is a big part of that because it centralises power in the hands of Downing Street at the expense of Parliament and the rest of us. So, whichever way you cut it, it's not an institution we should be supporting.
So just to be clear, I'm a Republican. Yep. So when I say things, it's because I'm playing devil's advocate and to sort of make sure your arguments are as robust as they can be so the audience can make their own minds up. The claim about corruption is an interesting one because some of the least corrupt countries on earth have constitutional monarchies. So, for instance, often the Nordics are a byword for accountability and transparency in public life. And they have constitutional monarchs in Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark. Same with the Netherlands. You could say the same with regards to Japan, has an emperor. So the corruption argument, I mean, I could come back to you and say, well, there are lots of other constitutional monarchies which aren't corrupt. Sure, we might need to make some changes, but we could still have a sovereign. What would you say to that?
Well, those countries, the Nordic countries, they may well not be that corrupt, but that corruption still exists within their own monarchies. Now, they might not always see it like that in the same way that many people in this country don't see it like that. But I have a close relationship with Republicans in those countries, and they are well aware that just as our monarchy abuses public money, so does theirs. They have various exemptions that they've lobbied for from laws such as official secrecy laws and so on. So it's on a different scale, and sometimes it's not so obvious. But a monarchy is. I mean, the comparison I make is the MP's expenses scandal, which is what now 13, 14 years ago. The issue is that if you have an institution which is not open and transparent and not properly accountable, and the people in that institution have access to money and to opportunity to lobby, knowing that no one's going to see what they're doing, there will be abuse. And that's just human nature. It's not everybody. Some people are good enough to, police themselves. But that is how the monarchy is. It's highly secretive. They've got access to everybody and anybody they want to have access to in terms of lobbying, and they have access to hundreds of millions of pounds of our money every year. And the end result is that they behave in a way that is corrupt. Now, the only way that you can really stop corruption is with transparency and accountability. And you can't do that with a monarchy because if you are transparent, you don't like what you see, that you can't do anything about it. You can't remove them. So you have to have the accountability in there as well, which means you have to have someone who can be removed and then choose someone else. So, it is kind of a design flaw that monarchies are inherently corrupt.
But I suppose the comparison here is, if you look at, for instance, let's just do Europe, because, we don't want to have too many variables at play. France and Italy have higher levels of corruption, both republics, than the Nordics. Or if you look in East Asia, Japan has less corruption than China. And these are on formal indexes for global corruption. That's not my opinion.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not saying that the monarchy makes Britain corrupt. I'm saying the monarchy itself is corrupt.
Right.
So the royal household, and it's not, they're not.
So we wouldn't have less corruption in public life if we became a republic.
No, I mean, I think
less,
I think you could have it, and there's a wider argument about the quality of our politics. I think that British politics is pretty poor across the board for all sorts of reasons, and there are certainly plenty of accusations of corruption. But I think that the household itself, I will give examples. Let's get into details. So, as I said, I'm not talking. Although I did report Charles to the police on suspicion of selling honours for donations in exchange for donations. And the police have just dragged their feet and still haven't done anything about that. So there is an accusation of criminality. It's only an accusation, and they still haven't done anything about it, which itself is telling. But there are, corruption doesn't have to be illegal. It just has to be, dishonest abuse of public office for personal gain. And they spend, again, look at the MP's expenses scandal. That was amounts of money that sort of ranged from the low hundreds up to the tens of thousands. The royals spend tens of millions, and certainly several millions at a time on things like doing up their palatial homes. They fly around by helicopter all the time, and they take the income from the two duchies, which should be going to the treasury. So
now, this is an extraordinary amount of money. I think a lot of people aren't aware of this. Can you just explain that, two duchies?
Yeah, so the two duchies are two landed estates that they were all part of the crown lands, and they were essentially hived off, and they were allowed to keep hold of them, and they treat them as private estates, but they're crown property. And each one of them brings in a profit of around £22 million a year, which goes to the Duchy of Lancaster now goes to Charles as monarch, and the Duchy of Cornwall now goes to William. So on the Queen's death, William suddenly gained a £22 million a year income for doing nothing other than being the son and heir to his father. And that money should be going to the Treasury. And some people will say, look, no, it's not a lot of money. I mean, I added up the incomes of heads of state, elected heads of state across Europe, and you add them all up, £22 million is 6 times all of them together. So it's a hell of a lot of money for someone who isn't even a head of state, in the case of William. But if you add those two amounts together, you're talking over £40 million, and £40 million was cut from a fund to help people with their rents and deposits. And when that was cut, people said, well, that's going to lead to more homelessness. So it's that kind of money that can have a real impact. And instead of it going to people that might be struggling with their rent, it's going into William's pocket.
Well, particularly Cornwall. I mean, £22 over 10 years, £220 million. If you look at Cornwall, it's one of the poorest regions in Europe. I mean, you just had the second round of levelling up funding, and I think they're spending £35 million on connecting the 4 largest urban areas in Cornwall. So basic infrastructure doesn't exist. And you're giving, like you say, someone who isn't even the monarch, £22 million a year.
Yes, and absolutely. And also, if you look at the Scilly Isles as well, which the Duchy of Cornwall claims to own, is questionable claim, but we can't prove otherwise. They claim to own most of the land there, and they lost their helicopter because it was being privately run, and it got closed down by the owner. And the Isles get completely cut off during winter months sometimes because it's too rough for boats and planes, so the helicopter is quite important. So they lost that, and Charles didn't lift a finger to help put it back. Now there is someone, a private investor, it's been gone for 10 years or more. So that's being reintroduced, but he doesn't lift a finger to help, or hasn't done. We went down to the Isles of Scilly, talked to people who are leaseholders, so they own their house, but it sits on duchy land. And they were exempted from leasehold reform laws, so they don't have the rights that anybody else has to buy their lease, to buy the freehold. They just simply can't do it, and that has a huge impact on their sort of financial future.
Which is very much a feudal remnant, right? The whole leasehold thing, but the fact that it's...
Well, indeed, yeah. But the various laws have been introduced over the last 60 years which give people rights to buy the freehold, and that the duchy was simply exempted from that on their land. But I mean, the Isles of Scilly is an interesting case. It kind of is run like its own little feudal state sometimes. And we talked to the taxi drivers. There's only 2 taxis on the island, and they said that you can tell the difference between the roads owned by the duchy and the roads owned by the council, because the duchy ones are falling apart. So that they don't get looked after. So he takes all this money and they don't put anything back in.
So this idea that he cares about the public good, and you don't think that's true? Or is he not? Are his affairs in the estate so large, so complex that there are just things that Charles clearly isn't going to have a sort of any idea about? He
is said to take a very close personal interest in the way the duchy was being run when he was the Duke of Cornwall. So I think he has to take responsibility for it. Whether he cares, I think he believes he cares, but he has, in terms of his own views on things, his agenda is not really shaped around people's real issues and problems. It's shaped around his own very rather odd, eccentric ideas, which again are based on a kind of a world view that is feudal and which sees the importance of someone like him in the middle and everybody else sort of ploughing the fields. I think that his environmentalism as well is that kind of mindset as well. So he takes his view, and he's not that open to criticism or to engaging with other people's opinions, and he'll just push his own view. So, and as far as his own interests are concerned, he has fought tooth and nail to protect them over the years, as have the rest of the royals.
What do you make of him personally? Because obviously you speak to so many people who are impacted by Charles. Obviously, there's been this gestation period for decades where he was waiting to become the head of state. And so I think lots of people have been able to form ideas and views on him, which wasn't necessarily the case for his mother before she became the sovereign. So as a human being, as a person, I'm not asking you to judge him because you don't know him, but from the information you've managed to gain, what's your read on the kind of person he is?
Well, I don't think that we would vote for him if there was a free and fair election in which he was up against other candidates. I think that he is, because of the world in which they're born into, they're quite prickly, quite thin-skinned. All of them are prone to a real temper. There's stuff about Harry and William recently has also been said about Charles. So he gets very angry. He's quite petulant, I think. And there have been various anecdotes of him being very sort of disinterested in any kind of serious criticism or discussion about his views. He presents his views. He expects people to sort of applaud and take them on and deliver on them. So he's not sort of intellectually engaged in that way. So and I don't think he really understands the world outside of his very immediate sort of circle of friends and advisors. So, yeah, I don't have a strong feeling, sort of view in terms of whether he's a good or bad person, but I think he is a complicated person who is not fit for public office.
And is he different from his mother and father in that respect? Because obviously, part of the strength of the brand of Elizabeth was that she was there for the Second World War. Prince Philip, obviously, not from the UK originally. He saw what it was like to lose power, for a monarchy to get the boot. His own family was in great jeopardy. So do you think there's a genuine absence of kind of real world experience amongst Charles and William, which actually you could say was sort of a bit of a forte for their grandmother and mother?
I don't think the Queen had real world experience. I mean, she was never sent to any kind of formal education. I think the stuff about her being in the army, I'm sure she did something, but it's not. She wasn't sent into the armed forces in the way that everybody else was. And they were all pretty, they're all the product of the same world. And Charles is a product of them as being parents, So
you don't think Charles is more closeted than his parents?
No, I think they're as much as, yeah. I think perhaps William and Harry a little bit less so, but not least because they had to go to, Charles went to school, but I think they grew up in a different era. So even the schools they went to wouldn't have been quite the same as the ones that the experience that Charles might have had. But yeah, I think the Queen's era and before, I think they were very closeted and in a very strange world that they grew up in.
Can we roll back a bit? You said she didn't do schooling.
Yeah, she didn't have a formal education.
So what do you mean? She didn't go to a primary school?
I don't think, as far as I'm aware, she didn't go to school at all. But
Wow.
She was educated at home, and the idea was that she was had to be, a lady.
So she had no formal education?
Don't quote me on that, but it certainly wasn't the sort of education that everybody else has. So, yeah, I mean, people say that there's this benefit of having this wise monarch. She became monarch at the age of 25 or 26, and Churchill was the prime minister, who was he 70 at the time, I think. I think the idea of her coming from this very closeted, strange world with not a lot of education, that she was then going to somehow be of any use to the 70-year-old Winston Churchill, who was back in for the second time, having been prime minister through a war, I think is a bit of a nonsense. You mentioned a moment ago about reporting now King Charles to the police. Can you expand on that a little? Yeah, so the Sunday Times reported that there was a letter that they'd got hold of between Michael Fawcett, who was then the CEO of one of Charles's charities, to a Saudi businessman. And this was fairly explicitly saying, we're going to get you an honour, a knighthood. And there was also a suggestion that they would help with his citizenship application, and saying, to be clear, this is in return for your generous support for the charity. Now, offering a knighthood in exchange for any kind of consideration is a criminal offence. And we had this back in Tony Blair's government when various people, including Blair, were interviewed on suspicion of doing the same thing. And that went nowhere because they couldn't prove the link. I think everyone could assume the link, but you couldn't prove it in a court of law. Cash for honours. Yeah. So, but with this letter, it was pretty black and white. Now, it seemed to me fairly obvious that Michael Fawcett, who is, he's a friend and a close confidant of Charles, he's been considered to be one of his closest confidants for years, he couldn't get or secure an honour for anybody without going through Charles. So the implication is that Charles and Fawcett were saying to people, if you give us donations, then we will secure an honour for you, which is a criminal offence, as I say. Now, I therefore I went onto the Metropolitan Police website and just reported it as a crime, saying, this needs to be investigated. And Norman Baker, the former Lib Dem MP, wrote to Cressida Dick, who was still at the time the head of the Metropolitan Police, and raised the same issue. And I mean, the Sunday Times haven't given up on this either, and they keep pursuing it with the police and saying what's going on. Late last year, I mean, this was in, I think, September 21, so it was over a year later, they said that they'd sent some file to the CPS, but they'd only talked to two individuals, neither of which was Charles. And there's still no news about what's going on. So it seems that they haven't even made any effort to interview Charles, or as someone quipped, they haven't even sent him a questionnaire. And they are just looking at Fawcett and someone else we don't know. So, which is, it seems to me the evidence is a lot clearer than it was with the politicians, whenever that was, 15 years ago. But the police just don't want to know. And what's the maximum sentence for this? I think it's 2 years. Also, it's a custodial sentence. I believe so, yeah. And now, obviously, Charlie and the Clink. Now Charles is king. There is a as yet untested theory that he can't be prosecuted. But I mean, it's unlikely they would get down to that point anyway. But I mean, they ought to. They ought to be pursuing it. Why couldn't he be prosecuted? Well, the regicides during the English Civil War. Well, indeed, but the King Charles I. Sorry, just to clarify for our audience. Sorry, my apologies. There was a civil war in this country. It should be called a revolution. The king was beheaded, and that was the result of a legal process. Indeed, but he was. My understanding is Charles I was prosecuted by Parliament, and the theory, at least, is that the law is prosecuted in the name of the monarch, and therefore the monarch can't be prosecuted because they would be prosecuting himself. So it would have to be Parliament that would take it into their own hands to sort of deal with it. But it's a theory that I think would be questionable and certainly be open to challenge in the Supreme Court if that actually became an issue. No, if he openly shot someone, for example. The king can't be prosecuted. That's the theory, yeah. And same was the theory with the Queen. But I mean, it's not unusual for heads of state elsewhere to have immunity, but of course you can remove the head of state from office and then prosecute.
And they're not there until they die.
And they're not there until they die, indeed. And they're not necessarily surrounded with the same level of sycophancy, and that immunity can normally be removed. But yeah, I mean, as I said, if Charles sort of just turned around on when he's out shooting and decided to shoot one of his friends dead, then in theory you couldn't prosecute him. But I think that in those circumstances, things would change. But there's a whole load of lesser crimes, such as and including cash runners, where that should be tested.
Are there any other royals who could face, apart from obviously the obvious case of Prince Andrew? Have there been any other sort of incidents where you yourself have been involved, perhaps?
Other royals are not immune, and Princess Anne was quite a long time ago prosecuted under the Dangerous Dogs Act because her dog attacked someone's kid, I think. But that's going back to the 90s. I did actually report Prince Andrew for a completely different matter back about 5 years ago now. And what I called Gate, which was where he deliberately rammed his vehicle into the gates at Great Windsor Park because they were supposed to automatically open for him and they didn't for whatever reason. And being a petulant, arrogant man, he just decided to ram his Range Rover straight into the gates and caused £80,000 worth of damage. And someone saw it and it got in the news. So I thought, well, that's criminal damage. So I reported them to the Thames Valley Police. And again, they didn't want to know. They gave some excuse about we don't deal with road traffic accidents where there were no injuries or deaths. I thought, this isn't a road traffic.
But this is taxpayer money.
Yeah, it was Crown Estate land, which is taxpayers' money. And
it's not a criminal offence. If I go down to the Crown Estate and I destroy it, I mean, I'm going to be charged with something.
Yeah,
surely.
I mean, I was tempted to go down and ram I don't have a car, but I mean, I'd hire one and ram that into the gates and see whether they took the same view. But I mean, it's as far as I know, Crown Estate picked up the bill and that was the end of that, and the police didn't want to know. And it wasn't a road traffic accident. It was a deliberate act of vandalism as far as the reports were concerned. But yeah, the police are very reluctant, I think, to get involved in prosecuting them. Any other cases?
You've got Anne, we've got Andrew, Charlie.
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're not actually a criminal gang as such. But I mean, there could well be things that they're getting up to. But I'm not aware of any other reports to the police. And but I mean, I think there's plenty of. When I said they're corrupt, I think the abuse of public money is an abuse of public money, but it's all signed off and, it's not illegal. But it is unethical. And if we look at, the Nolan principles that people have been talking about recently in relation to the current government and, the sort of instinctive principles such as integrity and honesty and selflessness and whatever, I would say on all of those principles, the palace and the royal family fall well short. Because if you were concerned about those values such as selflessness and honesty and transparency, then you wouldn't insist on being exempted from the Freedom of Information Act. You wouldn't spend hundreds of millions of pounds on your own homes and travel and all the rest of it. And you wouldn't accept the money from the duchies because it's not yours. And you wouldn't use your privileged position to lobby government ministers behind closed doors, insisting that lobbying doesn't see the light of day. So, it's that's what I mean by being corrupt.
How much taxpayer money does the royal family get a year?
Well, they will say that it's somewhere in the region of 85 million pounds, which is about half of which is currently being spent on doing up Buckingham Palace. Although I was just reading in the Private Eye that there's some disquiet in Whitehall that Charles now has no intention of using Buckingham Palace as his headquarters. So they're doing it up for reasons no one knows. But that's the sovereign grant, which is about £85 million at the moment each year, although they keep the reserve, and so last year they spent £101 million. But we've calculated that the total figure is more like £345 million. And that includes the duchy figures. It includes the cost of security, which is at least £100 million. And that covers quite a lot of the family, including they've got something like 24 homes to protect. When they go around the country and open things and visit people and whatever, then there's a huge cost, which is usually picked up by the local police and local council, and that can be quite substantial.
Is that for lesser royals too?
Yeah, because
there must be a cost benefit there. So we have a lesser rule. It's actually not that big a deal, and it's costing us an absolute bucket load.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it costs more for the higher ones, for the more senior ones, just because of the level of security. But I think that we did FOIs. The Queen did her Jubilee tour in 2012, and she kicked it off going to Leicester, and that cost Leicester, between the university, the council, and the police, £180,000 for a 4-hour visit.
Wow.
There's a case going way back to 2006 or something, Romsey in the south of England, fairly small town. The Queen went there for, again, 3 hours, I think, and it cost them £60,000, and that came out of the town council and wiped out their reserves. Because they were expected to do all of the crowd control stuff, had to do the whole process of sort of risk assessment and road closures and provide staff, and and they were told apparently in one venue to replace the toilets, which cost them £5,000. The costs do ramp up quite quickly, and if you add all that up, we had a ballpark figure of about £20 million across all local councils for a year. And there's various other sundry things, and also estimates of taxes unpaid and so on. So yeah, it's about £345 million at least every year that we either spend or lose.
And how much is it without the duchies? Because they could say, well, that's our own private estate. So how much of that is really taxpayer money?
Well, it's £300 million roughly, I suppose. But I mean, they can argue it's their estate, but it's not. So if
I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just thinking about the bottom line for the taxpayer over 10 years is about $3 billion.
Yeah, but I would always include the duchies, because there's no real argument there. I mean, they will claim it's theirs, but the test for me is what happens when we get rid of the monarchy. And most of that spending would go, and the income for the duchy would be rolled into the income for the Crown estate, and it would all go to the Treasury. So that would be a gain for us, plus a loss of all the expenses. If you look at the Irish president, for example, who is brilliant and widely liked and elected, that costs about €4 million a year. So there's a fraction of the cost that we're spending on the royals. And a large part of that cost is just on them living the lifestyles that they're accustomed to.
It's a huge amount of money. I mean, that is £340 million a year over 10 years, £3.4 billion. That's a lot of cash. That's a lot of schools and hospitals being built.
Yeah, you could, we worked out you can roughly pay about 13,000 teachers or nurses for that. And that's a lot of people, or police officers. I mean, we've lost about 20,000 police officers, and they keep going on about recruiting more. But I mean, I think we're still down on where we were 10 years ago. And yet the amount of money it costs to replace most of them is being spent on a dozen people.
Counter argument again would be that, well, fine, they do cost a lot of money, but actually in terms of the economics of it, which I think is a very weak argument for a constitutional system regardless, but anyway, on the economics of it, they're actually a net beneficiary because they contribute to tourism and people come to the UK and it helps brand Britain, and actually they make us money despite this extraordinary sum you just outlined. Why is that wrong?
Well, it's wrong on various levels. I mean, as you sort of alluded to, it's our constitution, and we should base that on principles and values and what works constitutionally, not what people enjoy doing on their holiday, which doesn't make any sense. It's wrong also because there's an odd logic that we have this public institution that makes money. That's great. It doesn't mean that we have to spend loads of money on those people. I mean, you could argue that the NHS makes money in the sense that it gets a whole load of people back to the workplace and therefore boosts our economy. But no, we're not paying nurses enough. So where's the logic that we throw hundreds of millions of pounds and don't account for it properly just because of this institution making money? But the main point is that it's not true. It doesn't make any money. There's no evidence for that. The tourism thing has been debunked. There's no evidence that having a monarchy brings more tourists in. There's some claims that it has a broader impact on our economy in terms of investment or trade and whatever, but again, there just isn't any evidence to support it. The largest figure that was put out was £500 million from tourism as a result of having the monarchy. That was put out by Visit Britain in 2011, I think it was, and that was debunked because it was just a
what was their working?
Their working was to take all of the ticket sales of every ticketed heritage venue in the country that had the remotest connection to the royals. Right. And I believe they included St. Paul's Cathedral, which is hugely iconic, massively popular venue in London to go and see as a tourist. And the fact that royals got married there 30 years earlier isn't really a good argument for suggesting that they are the responsible for bringing this in. They claimed in the run-up to the 2011 wedding that they did a press release, Visit Britain, and they
said, William and Kate.
Yeah, so they said, they put out a press release, as everybody does. Well, every company, every brand puts out all this rubbish about trying to get a piece of the rolling coverage about the wedding. So they put this thing out saying this is going to be a great boost for tourism. So we did an FOI request, Freedom of Information request, to their press office saying, can you show us how you got to this? And part of what we got back was an email from their research office saying you can't say that because it's not true. And their year-on-year comparisons from the 81 wedding and the 86 wedding showed a drop, not just year-on-year, but for the same month of the year. And after we gave that to the Guardian, and it was a big full page, they agreed to meet with us and talk about it. And they accepted in private that there's no evidence that if you get rid of the monarchy, we lose tourism. So it's a duff argument that makes no sense, and shouldn't be part of a conversation about our constitution.
I mean, I've heard the argument that Versailles makes more money than Buckingham Palace, and I think, again, that might be purely anecdotal, but I mean...
I'm sure it does, but I mean, Buckingham Palace is only open 2 months of the year, and Precisely. I've been there as a tourist, and it's not particularly interesting because it's so limited in what it can tell you, because the institution is still there. They don't want to give you a history of the individuals or the royals. It's kind of, here's some artwork, and here's some dresses, and, here's some... they had a exhibition of photos of the Queen. Right? Okay, I've seen the Queen before, but I mean, where's the actual history? And it tells you how many candlesticks and glasses and chairs and tables they have in the building, but nothing much else. And it's just not that interesting. But you don't have to go over to France to get a good comparison. If you look at Tower of London, which they haven't been in for a very long time, that's far more popular, far more profitable. And as far as I'm aware, it pays for itself through ticket sales.
Could we go as far to say as getting rid of the monarchy would actually increase tourism then? Because, you'd have more people at Buckingham Palace because it would be more of an attraction because it would actually be open.
Insofar as it will make any difference at all, yeah. I mean, that £500 million figure, people think that, it's a huge amount of money. It's nothing. It's like 0.001% of our GDP. So, it's less than the margin of error for calculating GDP. And I worked out if you were looking for £25,000 for... a deposit on your house, and as a way of helping you, I offered you £2.50. That's the equivalent of how much impact it makes. It's nothing, you wouldn't notice it if I gave it to you or didn't. So I think London would probably benefit from having the palace opened up. What I would do with it is turn it into a world-class museum and gallery, pedestrianise the Mall and Constitution Hill, which goes down the side of the palace, and open up the whole area as a kind of a place to exhibit and celebrate our history and including the warts and all sort of stuff about the monarchy, but also our democracy and all the fights that it took to get to a republic. So I think that would be far more interesting than this rather dull-looking building that's closed most of the year.
That's so inspiring. That's such an inspiring vision.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, it's a really good idea.
And there's some other beautiful buildings down there as well. I mean, you've got the Commonwealth headquarters down there, and you've got Clarence House and St James's Palace, which is just on the corner.
Somerset House, does that belong to them, or is it a separate entity?
I don't know. Not sure.
So your proposal is to turn the Mall into basically a giant LTN? Low traffic neighbourhood.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it'd be amazing. And, you could have it all the way from Trafalgar Square all the way down to the palace and leave all the gates open so you can go all the way through and through the courtyard. The quadrant where the Prime Minister's are seen going, all the way through to the gardens. I think it'd be a pretty impressive sight.
So let's go through some more arguments for the monarchy, which you're going to debunk. Stability. Britain is this uniquely stable country. We never had the rise of fascism. We're not prone to political extremes. I don't buy any of this, but fine. Let's just repeat these arguments. Partly, yes, because of our electoral system, that's equally dysfunctional, but park that for a moment. But partly because we have this constitutional monarch who sits above politics. So actually, you would never get something like what you get in Germany in the 30s or Italy in the 20s.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't stack up. I mean, you only have to, people say, look at Germany, and Churchill is quoted as saying, look, you know, if Germany had kept the Kaiser, they wouldn't have had Hitler. But he's conveniently ignoring Italy, where Mussolini was put on given the job to head the government by the king, who then sat there and let him, 20 years he's on the throne all the way through to the end of Mussolini's reign and did nothing. So monarchies are of no use whatsoever, because the monarch's first duty is to protect the monarchy, and they will make accommodations for whatever dictator they have to make accommodations for. The German Kaiser, who lived in the Netherlands after the First World War, after being deposed, would often write to Hitler. He was no fan of Hitler, I should say that, but he would write to Hitler trying to get his family put back on the throne with Hitler still as Chancellor. So he's certainly
I didn't know that.
Prepared to accommodate Hitler, even if he wasn't. I mean, he thought he was a horrendous man, but not to the point that he wouldn't, allow himself to be accommodated for the restoration of the German monarchy. And, you look at the Greek monarchy, they had a republic, and the Greek king went along with a rigged plebiscite restoration of the monarchy just before the Second World War, and then sat back and let a fascist take over. His nephew became king after the war, and was, I mean, he sort of tried to avoid the coup in the 60s, but completely failed. And so Greeks, fell under the control of the generals, who subsequently got rid of the monarchy. And when they were a democracy again, the Greeks had a referendum and said, yeah, we don't want that again because it didn't work. And if you look at places like Cambodia and Thailand, their monarchs have been absolutely catastrophic in terms of protecting democracy or people's rights. They are very much part of those networks of dictatorship and kleptocracy that have caused all sorts of misery in those countries. So, monarchies are not good at protecting anything. The fact that we have been stable has been a result of any number of different forces. I mean, when we say we've been stable, obviously we had 40 years of political violence in which 3,000 people died. So to the extent to which we are stable, I mean, the Westminster government...
You're talking about Ireland?
Yeah.
Also, can I just say, also a civil war, right? Like you have the United Kingdom, which includes the whole of the island of Ireland, and a huge chunk of it breaks away in what is a seditious civil war. Like that is not... The fact this isn't taught as a civil war, I just find so strange. Yes. We've had hundreds of years of stability. Like...
Indeed. And I can't remember where I read this. I was reading some history of sort of early 20th century, pre-First World War, and there was quite a lot of worry that would blow up into a wider civil war across the UK. And it was the First World War that sort of dispersed that threat. But yeah, there's been a lot of violence there. And then obviously we've got 50% of Scots want to break away. There's a lot of people in Wales that want to separate. So it's not exactly a unified, and at the moment, even in Westminster, not particularly stable. So it's a whole load of things. But the monarchy doesn't help any of this. It doesn't contribute to the stability. What it does do is centralise power in Downing Street. And it certainly doesn't provide us with a monarch who can protect us or defend the Constitution.
So last one. We've rebutted the economics. We've rebutted the stability. I think you've made a pretty good argument in regards to corruption. Tradition, which is, I suppose, less rational. This is the thing that defines Britain. We are a monarchy. Dieu et mon droit, which is, that's about the right of the king or the queen, not the right of any of us. People don't seem to get that. So what's the argument there? If somebody likes tradition and it's traditional to have a monarch in the UK, how do you say, well, actually, you're wrong?
Well, I mean, I can't remember who it was that said it, but they said that tradition is the democracy of the dead. And it's kind of this idea that decisions made by people who died 200 years ago should be sacrosanct and not challenged. And that's all that we're saying, because traditions have all been invented by someone at some point, and most of them not that long ago. And so why should we be any more constrained to change things than they were? They didn't feel the need to stick with what they had. They changed it when they invented things like all the honours, for example.
When were honours invented?
Well, a lot of them most of the OBE and the CBE and all that was 1917. So very recent. I mean, it's more recent than the invention of powered flight, and yet people talk about it as if it's some kind of ancient tradition. So some of the...
Why 1917? Sorry, just like literally 1 year away from the end of the First World War. Why then?
I think it was part of the general... It was the same year that they changed their name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. And I think it was part of the general sort of wanting to ingratiate themselves with the wider public. I think there was a sense that there was this sort of, not quite revolution, but there was certainly a social shift caused by the First World War and the, equalization of everybody dying together, and the huge trauma that it caused. They were sort of... aware that they needed to do something, and if we believe, their sort of version of it, that they wanted to genuinely recognise and honour people who had done exceptional things beyond those who were already getting sort of medals, military medals like the Victoria Cross, for example. But I mean, the change in the Guard dates back to, I think, Victoria, or maybe William IV, who was just before Victoria. So it's old, but it's not that old, and all these things have been invented and reinvented and all the rest of it. And there's no reason why we can't reinvent things as well. That's the tradition, is that we keep creating new traditions. But I'd say that the better argument is that we have a whole load of better traditions, such as fighting for democracy, such as, fighting for people's rights, whether it's workers' rights, voting rights, suffrage. So the tradition of, whether it's the Toll Bottom Martyrs or the suffragettes or the gay rights movement, Black Lives Matter, those movements and what they represent are traditions which we should be symbolising and representing in our institutions, not the tradition of feudal kings and aristocrats. I think if a tradition is good, fine, keep it. If it's important, keep it. But if it's there to try and sustain a structure of power and privilege, get rid of it.
I think it was Macmillan that said this, and I'm probably wrong. I think it was Macmillan, about conservatism should conserve the good things and not conserve the bad things. Like you say, there are good and bad traditions, right? Just because something is a tradition, ancestor worship was a tradition. I mean, it's
indeed. I mean, there's all sorts of things being traditions, and you shouldn't sort of do a kind of, you don't want to go the other way and have a kind of year zero thing where you just throw everything out and try and reinvent things, because they're part of human life. They're part of our, we grow up with things and we want our world to feel familiar and all the rest of it. But if something is actually a problem, then get rid of it. And that's part of how societies evolve, and every generation has to make its own decisions about what it keeps and what it gets rid of. And I'm sure up until the late 18th century, French royalists would have said this is tradition. Now they've got 200 years tradition of being a republic. I think that if we are talking about having a history that we're proud of and which we want to celebrate, I think that, after a few decades of being a republic, that's going to be something which we will celebrate, because it's something which we did, which we chose to do. And on the day that we do become a republic, it's going to be a huge global event. Everyone will be sitting there, wow, the British, the least likely country to do this, have stood up and got rid of the monarchy. That's going to be a huge moment, and that's going to be something which we will then celebrate every year from then on.
I love this. So this complete inversion of the common sense, like it makes us money. Or actually, no, maybe we could make more money from tourism if we didn't have a monarchy. Oh, actually, when Queen Elizabeth died, billions of people, apparently that's complete nonsense, obviously, not billions of people, their eyes were on the UK. Well, actually, there'd be far more attention. And, brand Britain would benefit from being a republic. My favourite one as well, actually, is the Crown Jewels. Yeah. A lot of people don't know this, but, the Crown Jewels as we know them are only from the Glorious Revolution. They're from the 1680s onwards, because Cromwell melted, Crown Jewels 1.0. Which I find quite amusing.
I think there's one item that predates him that was saved somewhere, but yeah, it's all fairly recent.
What's that? There's one crown, isn't it? That's like
I think it's like a spoon or something.
A spoon?
Something like that. I can't really remember. But yeah, it's all, a lot of this is very new. I mean, a lot of it is Victorian times, A lot of the monarchy that we know and recognise is Victorian, or even Edwardian, which is only, 110 years ago. So,
why a spoon? Why was a spoon saved? Do you have any idea?
No, I really don't know. It might not have been. This is what I think I read somewhere or heard somewhere. But I mean, there's not much of it left. It's all very new, well, relatively new, and a lot of it comes from Victorian times. A lot of it was stolen from various parts of the empire. I mean, it is what it is. But I don't get too excited by the crown jewels.
There's a crown, isn't there? I think one of the oldest existing crowns is like the it was a Frankish crown or something. I think it goes like 900 AD, maybe 1000 AD, and it ended up in the crown jewels of the Austro-Habsburg Empire. Right. You think if there's something that lasted that long, and in the last century that stopped being, Austro-Hungarian Empire obviously collapsed, and they're both republics. Whatever you think about Viktor Orban, if something that long and quote unquote traditional can sort of come to an end, then I presume a 300-year-old monarchy can too.
Well, I mean, this is the thing: it will always be there as part of our history. We won't lose the history. We won't lose the palaces or the castles. It will all be there, and the crown jewels will still be there. I mean, whether or not we give some of it back, I don't know. But you can still do all that. I mean, at the moment, you go to the Tower of London, which is not an actual royal residence. I haven't lived there for a very long time. To go and see the crown jewels, it's just a museum. And I went there, and I took my nephews there last year, and I hadn't seen the crown jewels for a very long time. I wasn't massively impressed. I mean, obviously very expensive, lots of security, but it looked an awful lot like bling, and not. I just thought there's something very odd and childish about these jewels and the crowns, that it goes back to hundreds of years ago when these precious metals meant something. So dressing yourself up in them was a sign of power and status and wealth more than anything. It's like, I can buy you whatever you want if you go and fight my wars for me, that sort of thing. But nowadays it just looks slightly ridiculous. Prince
Harry, you've mentioned a while ago that Charles and William can be disposed to being quite petulant, childish, I suppose is a better word as well. Throw tantrums, they like to get what they want. Is Harry a bit different?
Well, I think he sort of admitted that he's not that different. I mean, I think they've all grown up in the same weird world. I think he is different only in the sense that he's obviously made that journey and left. And I think that obviously Meghan Markle's probably had an influence on him. I think this is just my sort of pop psychology, and I don't have any particular view on Harry as such, but I think that he's very much a product of his mother's upbringing, and more importantly, the loss of his mother and what happened afterwards. I think he's someone who has struggled to sort of come to terms with that, and has also, I think one of the awful things really, I think that's come out of Spare, is that he was always made to feel second fiddle to his brother. And that, any family can sort of have that sibling rivalry, and, the older one might get treated differently or whatever. But on the whole, I think most good parents would try and treat their kids equally and make sure they all have a good upbringing. But he was very clearly told, you are less important than your brother because he's going to be king. And I think that is pretty awful as well. And that seems to have, I think that comes out of what he said recently. So, yeah, I think he's different. I think that some of that petulant behavior comes through, but also I think he's kind of understood that as well. And, he's sort of talked about the racist language he's used in the past, and sort of admitted that, this came out of the world in which he grew up. So he sort of had a bit of an insight into that and a bit of a reflection on it. But, I don't know him well enough to know whether, exactly how different he is from his brother, but I can't imagine they'd be that different.
How big a crisis for the royal family is Spare? I mean, this is the most successful work of non-fiction ever. It's beaten Obama in the first week. It's broken all the records in terms of UK, US, Canada sales. Is this sort of unprecedented for the royals, do you think? Where does it sit in the context of crises for the Windsors?
I think it's very damaging for all sorts of reasons. I mean, I think the timing and the fact that the Queen has died, she was their heat shield. She protected them from an awful lot, not least because people could always sort of set her to one side and say, she's wonderful, perfect, never puts a foot wrong. It's the princes, they're a bit of a problem, etc. And then even with Charles, it'll be different when he's king. But now he is king, and we have someone that people are not deferential to as king. And then this blows up. I think also The Crown, the Netflix series, doesn't help as well, because it's reminded a lot of people, or told a lot of people that didn't know, of their previous sort of generations of divorces and affairs and all the intrigues and whatever. And the monarchy survives on the mystery. There's Walter Badger that said, don't let the light in on the magic, which is a kind of an old way of saying, believe the spin and the hype. Don't dig into exactly what's going on behind closed doors. But those, light is being shed on what goes on behind closed doors, and it's not good. So it's only going to be damaging to them. Now, how damaging and how to what extent things unravel for them is difficult to say, because they have a very, very well resourced PR machine. They have quite a lot of leverage with the media, particularly the broadcasters, and they have all these big set piece events. But even now, we've seen a sharp drop in support for the monarchy. So from 75 to 55% at the extremes. We got one poll just before Christmas put support for abolition up at 31%, which is unusual. The net approval rating is dropped by about 25%. And even there was a question asked, I think it was YouGov just last week or the week before, where they said, are you proud of the monarchy? And those saying they were proud of it, it dropped to 43%.
Wow.
Which is extraordinary.
That's really interesting.
And one of the things we noticed is when we do the yes, no, do you want to have an elected head of state or a monarchy, or do you want to keep the monarchy or abolish the monarchy? 15% say they don't know. Now, those are people that clearly don't like the monarchy that much anymore. Otherwise, they'll be saying keep it. But they haven't quite engaged with the issue of what comes next, so they don't know. So I think that there is a big opportunity to get the debate going, get people talking about it, understand what the alternative is, which is really simple and democratic. And then I think we'll start to see opinion shift sharper, which is also why I think that if, for example, Australia went down that road, or other Commonwealth countries, it will help as a kind of a guide of that's what it looks like when you get rid of it, and it looks really good.
Sticking on the polling for a second, because I do want to talk about Australia. This morning, late last night, it's obviously the other side of the world, we had the news that Australia's currency won't have King Charles's head on it. I think a big statement of intent, I think, for Republicans in that country. Yeah. But on the polling, I mean, Ipsos Mori had Prince Harry down 8 points after the publication of Spare. So his personal approval ratings took a massive hit. And this is something the whole media talked about, right? What they failed to mention is that even the most popular people within the institution, which is Harry and Kate, they also went down 8. And Charles isn't particularly popular anyway. So if you're, I don't quite get this argument that they make, but if you're a Republican and Harry is basically taking a torch to the credibility of the House of Windsor, and he's also undermining his own sort of brand too, as a Republican, why would I care? I don't quite get it. So it does seem to me like a really signal moment. And again, going back to the Ipsos Mori thing, I can't remember the precise question, but it was like, in the future, would you like it to be abolished or not exist? It wasn't like, should we abolish the monarchy? It was a roundabout way of asking it. And the people that said yes was about 25%. And that was an increase since the publication of Spare of 3%, just in a month. And I think in the space of 7 or 8 years, it was an increase of 10%, which is just really extraordinary. And then finally and of course these things go up and down, but that is, I think, quite big. On Gen Z, which it should be said is like not a huge number of people. It's, people who are 18 to 24, younger people. They were actually in support of the monarchy until several years ago. And then you've seen a massive, massive surge towards republicanism amongst that age cohort, a bit like you see with Scottish independence, et cetera, very much at odds with the kind of the common sense that the media is telling us about.
Yeah. I mean, the Gen Z thing, I mean, there was a poll that even not just under 25s, but under 35s had shifted away from the monarchy by quite significant numbers. And when this first came out, it was 2018 that was the benchmark, which was the year that Harry and Meghan got married, and where it was something like 40% of young people were in favour, 30% wanted to get rid of it, and it completely flipped the other way within 4 years. And of course, in those 4 years, you've had the Oprah interview, Harry and Meghan leaving, and all the accusations around that. You've also had things like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and everything else. And I think that there is a kind of the zeitgeist is of all of these what some people might call woke issues, but I mean, which is a phrase I hate, but I mean, it's an easy short term. All of this has come up, and I think it's driving a wedge on this particular issue of the monarchy between younger and older people. And I think that's more stark now than it's ever been before. But I mean, you say it goes up and down, and it might go back the other way. But there's quite a lot of polling asking different types of questions, including the ones like you said about the individual royals. But the pattern, as far as I can see across the board, is going against them. So it's a matter of whether we can keep pushing against them. And one of the things I do think is the big challenge for us is to get people talking about the alternative and to engage with it beyond the soap opera. And it's not just about, do you like William or Harry? It's about, there are serious issues here, let's get rid of it. And it's not that difficult.
Finally, on Harry, I mean, this is why I find him such an intriguing character, is that what him and Meghan wanted, from what they seem to say, and there's obviously so many PR plays at work, they wanted like an intersectional monarchy. It just seems so strange that like they're talking in this very egalitarian, meritocratic language. Anyone can marry, the brother to the future king of the United Kingdom. Just, it's completely absurd. Is that your read on it? Do you think there's kind of a big contradiction there?
There is a contradiction in the way they talk about this. I mean, he was asked in these interviews after The Spare came out that, do you still believe in the monarchy? And he said yes. And I think I can understand why he would say that, because that's been his world. But I think that undermines him a bit. And I think that to some extent, the fact that they kept the titles, when they first announced they were leaving and they sort of tried to do this half in, half out thing, and were told, no, you've got to, either you stay or you go, but they wanted to keep the titles. And there was a sense that they wanted the monarchy on their terms. And I would say, well, you can't have the monarchy at all. You shouldn't have it at all. And if you're going to go away, and if you're going to talk about all these egalitarian issues or, race or whatever, then you have to go the full journey all the way to the end and say, look, the monarchy makes no sense. So it sounds a little bit naive at best, self-serving at worst. But I think that inherent contradiction is as much a product of Harry's upbringing. It's quite a big leap. And whether he takes that final step, I don't know. I think it's unlikely.
I do hope so. I hope he's joining you on a protest in 10 years' time.
Well, that would be great. I mean, maybe there's speculation he'll go to the coronation in May, so maybe he'll stop off and pick up one of our banners. But that would make headlines. But I would hope so. But who knows? Meghan Markle's an interesting one because obviously she's American. I think Americans have a very odd, peculiar idea of our monarchy, but none of them would want it in their country. And you would think that she would be more instinctively Republican, as in, not American Republican, but instinctively sort of, anti-monarchy, as it were. But yeah, she seems to have bought into it all as well. But it's a complicated one.
Australia and Canada. Okay, I just want to talk about these two because I think, like you said, there's a really strong argument to say that if these two large Anglophone countries, quite prominent in our globalized Anglophone culture, if they became republics, I think that would be a massive, massive thing. Do you think that Australia and Canada will be republics in our lifetime? I mean, that's a very broad term. That could be a very long time. Within a generation, let's say 20 years, is that possible? Yeah,
Australia, yes. Canada, probably. I mean, I think that over the last 5 years, support for the monarchy in Canada has collapsed, so it's well below 50% now.
Why is that?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's generational. I think it's that they've had a few issues with their Governor General, which has thrown the spotlight on it. So they had Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister, used the Governor General to suspend Parliament when they to avoid a confidence vote back in 2009, and then they had a Governor General who had to resign for accusations of bullying, I think. So it's kind of thrown the spotlight on it a bit. And I think that, all the issues that we are also hearing about, such as, Meghan Markle and Harry and all the rest of it, they're also hearing about. So I think there's a number of things going on there.
It's quite difficult for them to get rid of the monarchy, though, isn't it?
Yes, I was going to say they have to have agreement of all of the provinces, but the Republican movement there say it's actually not as difficult as is made out. But there has to be a path to doing that, and I think they can get there. Australia is not easy mathematically because they need to get a majority of the states to vote for it, plus a majority across Australia, and they fell well short last time. But and the majority now in the polling is not unassailable, so there's no guarantee that they'll win it if they ran another referendum now. But the current government is quite clearly pro-republic, and they have a Republic minister for the first time.
This is Albanese. He's a Republican, right?
He's a Republican, and he's very open and clear about that in a way that the previous two Labour prime ministers were not. I mean, they were Republican, but they sort of kicked it into the long grass and didn't want to do anything about it. But so he's been very clear about it, and they've appointed a minister of the Republic. And then, as you said, they've now introduced these new $5 notes without Charles on them. Which has clearly whipped up the debate again. The constitutional monarchists are getting upset and jumping up and down about it. But so it's they could lose it. But I think that if they play the cards right and are sensible about it and do a good job, that they can win it. And I think that they will do it differently to last time. They're likely to have a in principle plebiscite, non-binding plebiscite. Do you want to remove the monarchy as the head of state and become an Australian republic? And if that gets through, then have a binding referendum, which is more likely to succeed.
What do you think it says about the national self-esteem of the British, that we might be the last people in the Anglophone world of this former empire that are lumbered, I should say actually, the English, that we're the last people that are lumbered with this institution? The Australians don't want it, the Canadians don't want it, the Scots and Welsh don't want it, but the English will remain, let's say, infatuated with it for another decade or two at least. What does that say about the English nation?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know that we're as infatuated as people like to think.
Some people are, right?
Some people are.
It's a big chunk of English civil society, which is. We can talk about the media. We'll talk about that in a moment. And clearly it's a huge variable. But millions of people feel passionately about the monarchy.
Yes, and I think that there will always be those people. I mean, even when we get rid of it, they'll still be there, sort of weeping into their souvenir cups of tea. But I don't know. It's hard to say what it says. I'm loath to sort of say anything about the English psyche as a whole, because I just think that it's not as wedded to the royals as people think. I think that a lot of people, possibly a majority, are fairly indifferent. And it's kind of this quote from Thomas Paine, who said, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives the impression of it being right. And so people just haven't really thought about it that much. I mean, if you look at the polling, going back to what we were saying before about the polling, there's other polling which we've done about how interested you are in the royals. Now, at the Jubilee just last year, the Queen's 70th Jubilee, 14% were going to celebrate. And we did polling for the two big weddings, so William and Harry, and it was something like 75 or 66% not interested. Now, it's probably weighted slightly. Those who are interested is probably leaning towards England and probably the southeast. And we were down protesting at the Jubilee in 2012, and someone commented that the crowds of royalists waving their flags in the middle of London, it didn't look like a London crowd. It looked like a home counties crowd who come in for the day, And so I think that there is a strong body of people who are obsessed and fascinated, but I think that it is not reflective of the rest of us.
It's like the coffin thing. When you had about 250,000 people go through Westminster Abbey saying, farewell to the Queen. It was a closed casket. You're literally walking. I try to get into the minds of these people, right? But it's a closed casket. You're just walking past a wooden box. I mean, 250,000 people went, Graham. That does say something, and I think that's deeply irrational. Obviously, they don't. I think that's deeply irrational, almost inexplicable, to stand in a queue for 18 hours to do that. 250,000 people did it.
Yeah, but I mean, what I say again, I mean, there is a body of, it's 250,000 people, yes, but I mean, there's 65 million people in the country, and if a substantial minority are like that, then yeah, you can get 250,000 people. But there were people that did get in the minds of these people. It's psychologists, sort of people who study the sociology of crowds and things. They went down and interviewed them and did studies of this queue. And some interesting stuff that came out of it, which is that, a lot of people weren't really there because they were in love with the Queen and grieving or mourning or anything like that. It was just something that you want to be part of. You wanted to, be able to tell your kids, yes, I was there, or you just wanted to be part of something that you saw everybody else being a part of. And it was to some extent manufactured as well, because there's lots of people were saying you didn't, in this day and age, you could just gone online and sort of done a electronic queue where your phone sort of lights up and says, right, notification, it's now your turn to go in. So there's a bit of manufactured queuing. But I'm not saying that there isn't a large body of people that are like that, but again, those people represent a minority. Most people are not remotely interested in going and queuing at the Queen's coffin, or even going down and watching the coronation.
I love that, the idea of like the supreme political spectacle in this country being a queue. In most countries it'd be a rally,
it's very British, but and slightly absurd. But again, it's one of those things that we haven't seen the death of a monarch for 70 odd years. So I guess people have thought, well, it's not going to come around again for another 20 or 30 years, so something to do.
So you touched upon the media and the role they play in manufacturing consent for what people think they think. It's not often what people think because they haven't actually thought about it, but what people think they think about the monarchy and the implausibility of a republic or an alternative. How big a role does the media play in terms of the popularity of the monarchy?
Well, I think obviously most of what everybody sees about the monarchy goes through the media, so quite a substantial role. There's an argument as to whether that is sort of deliberate on the part of the media, or to what extent there's collusion with the royals and all the rest of it. But of course, most people only see it through the lens of the way it's reported, and a lot of that is the journalists themselves and the press and whatever are also repeating what they've heard, aren't really taking it that seriously because it's more interested in what dresses they wear, what charities they're visiting, and whatever. But they will. I met a former royal correspondent who was doing the job back in the 80s, and I told him what I did, and he said, "I wish you were around when I was doing it, because we would have had other people to talk to about this and get some kind of conflict and more interesting stories." So there is an appetite for that kind of thing, but there is a unhealthy relationship between the institution of the monarchy and the media. And with the press, the press is free press. They can do what they want and say what they want if they want to support the monarchy. But there is still a carrot and stick relationship where they will give or refuse access, depending on what sort of coverage they get from the relevant paper. And that causes a degree of self-censorship. And then there is the BBC, to some extent the other broadcasters, but the BBC, who directly and continuously collude with them in terms of broadcasting their big events, who have been absolutely dreadful in terms of reflecting the diversity of opinion, who always project these big things as being universally liked and celebrated and all the rest of it. And they've been recently talking about their how they deal with bias on various other issues like the economy and so on. This is the one they need to deal with, in my view, more urgently than anything else, because they fail on it so completely and comprehensively. They just don't get it right at all.
I suppose, how can they? Because they operate with a charter, and it's a royal charter. Like the BBC, it's like so many parts of the British apparatus, it literally can't exist without. It's a bit different to the economy, because I obviously agree with you, the misreporting around austerity and so on and so forth. Yeah. And there's been, for whatever, I have many criticisms of the BBC. Clearly that shows it's at least capable of introspection and improvement, right? The thing about the economics reporting. I wonder, is that plausible with the monarchy stuff, just purely because of how it functions?
The Royal Charter is a political thing. It's not it's something which is given by, it just means it's been agreed through the Privy Council, which is a council of ministers. So it doesn't really make a lot of difference. And in the same way, the government essentially decides the fate of the BBC, and yet they're expected to be impartial on political commentary and reporting, which, on the whole, I think they probably are. But they often get criticised for not being, and have been often criticised for being too timid in the face of whichever government happens to be. They had this accusation under Blair as well as under the current government. But but the level of failure and collusion, I think, is far greater here. They just don't make much of an effort. You don't get the sense from watching BBC coverage that there is any real body of opposition. And they take let's say it's 66% for the monarchy. They assume that is 66% of people who are like Jacob Rees-Mogg with the monarchy, that love it and think the monarch is amazing and really believe the whole thing, rather than this much more interesting, complex picture of what people feel about it. And there are various examples where we have tried to challenge them on this, and they just don't really engage with it at all. They have a particular way of thinking about it, and they don't, for whatever reason, they don't want to move away from that. And the upshot is a incredibly distorted picture of the way in which the public view the monarchy and the monarchy itself.
And what's your relationship like with the BBC? Of all the media outlets, you think, oh God, they're not going to give us a fair crack of the whip?
Well, we're on every now and again. I usually have to chase them, and a lot of it comes down to individual producers, editors, journalists, whatever. It's very hit and miss depending on what the issue is and what the day is. And the week after the Queen died, they just didn't want to know. And I think that, and they would have said, well, the Queen's died, it's not a time to talk about it. And it's like, well, it's a hereditary monarchy, so you can't do that. You can't say we want a hereditary monarchy, which is based on births, deaths, and marriages, and therefore the change of monarch is when she dies, and then say, well, we can't talk about it. That's what we talk about, and that's when we talk about it. Not least because it's also the accession of Charles, but they just didn't want to know.
And how did that compare to people like Sky or Channel 4? Because I know they're much smaller, but my personal experience, for instance, during the Corbyn years with Labour Party reporting, Sky weren't perfect. Yeah. And I think Channel 4, their editorial line is generally a bit more distinctly liberal / left-wing, that's why the Tories don't like them. Yeah. But Sky at that point was owned by Rupert Murdoch at that point. But I actually felt they gave a fairer crack of the whip to arguments you wouldn't often hear.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that, even to some extent, ITV, again, it comes down to the individual journalists and editors and producers, but I've often had an easier time of just getting the story right, or getting, sort of engaging with the journalists with Sky, ITV, Channel 5 News as well. And Channel 4 News tends not to get into the issue quite so much anyway, certainly on the trivial stuff. But yeah, there's something, back at the time, I think it was the Wedding 2011 Today programme phoned me up and said, can you come on and tell us about, we want to talk about how this is a really bad time for Republicans because everyone's celebrating the wedding. And I said, well, actually, it's a really good time for us because we're getting loads of interviews and we're getting thousands of pounds coming in, loads of new members, and the invitation was withdrawn because I wasn't prepared to do what they wanted. No. So instead, they went to Sue Townsend, who wrote something about sort of, this is really awful, just keep our heads down, and got an actor to read it out, which is not journalism, But that presented...
That's propaganda.
Yeah, indeed. So, and this is... They wrote to... And again, it's a vast network, a corporation, but they were doing a piece...
But Today programme is their flagship radio show.
Yeah, and it's... they've had... was it last year? I think about a year ago, they had Jonathan... This cash for honours thing. They had Jonathan Dimbleby come on, Jonathan Dimbleby. He was a close personal friend of Charles, to interview him about the cash for honours, who said, it beggars belief that Charles would have known anything about it. Of course, it's not possibly right. But where was the counter view? And there was a case in 2012 for the Jubilee. They were doing a thing with Gary Barlow, where he was going around the Commonwealth, and basically they were talking to people in various different Commonwealth countries, and they emailed some Australian Republicans. And they said, we want to talk to people who want an Australian Republic. But then they said, but you don't want to hear a bad word about the Queen. We don't want to hear anything that is critical of her. So these Australian Republicans, who we were in touch with anyway, they forwarded the email to us, and we press released it and said, what the hell are you doing? But it didn't change their view. They promised us in 2012, we had a meeting with them, senior executives, and they said, well, we try and achieve balance over time. No, so now it's 11 years later. So I'm about to write another letter to them and saying, you've now had 11 years. So when does this? You've got a lot of balance to make up for. So can we sort of have maybe 6 solid weeks of pro-Republican coverage to make up for it? But yeah, and again, a lot of it is cultural. But I mean, David Dimbleby gave a lecture last year, I think it was, after the funeral, and he was involved in the funeral, but he was saying that he was criticising the BBC for being too close to the royal family. And when they were filming the funeral, they were getting minute by minute emails coming from the palace saying that bit of footage you can't use again, that bit of footage don't show again, and the BBC just goes along with it.
Wow.
Say, and
that is not a public service broadcaster.
No,
that is not a public service broadcaster. Does not behave like that.
No, indeed. In the same way that they did the 1969 documentary, The Royals, or whatever it's called, Royal Family, and then they stopped showing. I think they repeated it in the early 70s, and then the Queen said never again. So, and the BBC said fine, but it's a BBC documentary, so why are they doing that?
License fee payers paid for it.
Yeah. So it's a very odd relationship, and I mean, David Dimbleby was interested. He's interestingly critical in saying it's too much deference, and they don't get into some of these scandalous stories, such as the cash for honours. They just all they do. I mean, Nicholas Witchell, who I think the Independent even did a piece not that long ago about 5 times that he was deferential or whatever. But I mean,
even Prince Charles at the time was sort of, he's not that awful man again. Even he's like, God, please just tone it down.
And there's something odd about royal correspondence. But I mean, he was the one that started saying, after he had agreed to pay off Virginia Giuffre, saying, maybe he can start to do something for charities dealing with domestic violence or something as a way back. And it was like he was there promoting a way back for Andrew.
It's like a press officer, basically.
Yeah, and I was like, what charity in their right mind would want Andrew anywhere near them, particularly one that deals with vulnerable women? I mean, it's just such a weird thing to say. But yeah, it's a very strange. We did a thing. Again, going back quite a while ago, that we sort of looked at all their stories on their BBC News website, and we went back to other stories that we'd had in the press. So we're quite often quoted in the press, or we give stories to the press about things like reporting charges to the police. And we came up with quite a few serious stories that the BBC had largely ignored, and a long list of things like, Prince Philip stubbed his toe, and Prince Charles said he likes his son, that kind of nonsense, which gets reported. And I say that people think I'm joking, but there are things like, Prince Charles has said how proud he is of William, that sort of thing, as if that's worthy of some kind of news coverage. So yeah, I think it's a culture rather than a conspiracy. But I think that there is an element of collusion which they just think is part of their job, and I think that needs to end.
Emblematic of this was, I think, on the day of the release of Spare, on the day, there were 3 separate articles on BBC Online. I've actually got the titles here, right? This is the title of one of them. This is on BBC Online. Harry's memoir, Spare, displayed beside How to Kill Your Family novel. Yeah. So it's like, this is a story about a little independent bookshop. Haha. A book review. Who knows? I didn't know that the BBC apparently has book reviews now. The weirdest book ever written by a royal. Another piece was titled, Why Americans Seem More Pro-Harry Than Brits. That's 3 BBC articles on the same day that Spare is published. And you think, this is public relations. This is not public service journalism.
Yeah.
You think you would say that's a fair accusation?
Absolutely. And it's commonplace. And particularly, I mean, we did last year with the Jubilee. I went through, because they have a kind of a whole page of where you can see all the stories that they've done for the Jubilee. And you can flick through it, and there's about 400 of them. One of them mentions us, maybe 2. One of them was about us. And it was about the fact that we'd had these billboards everywhere saying, make Elizabeth the last. And all the others are sort of, some bishop in Wales has commented on how wonderful the Queen was, and, someone that met her once said how wonderful that was. And the one time they talk about us, it's Republican billboard or divisive Republican billboards, and it started with the criticism of the billboards rather than the fact that there is this growing campaign that is doing billboards and is making a splash, which was getting reported in all the press, including overseas and New York Times and Washington Post and whatever. So it was making a big splash, but all the BBC could do was quote one person.
The lead was the criticism rather than the thing.
Yeah. And the headline was divisive, like as if, these people causing trouble when everybody else is enjoying themselves. And I don't have a problem if they want to criticize us or challenge us, but in the context of everything else they do, it's appallingly one-sided. And it leaves people even now thinking that, they are kind of the only Republican in the village because they think that they don't see enough of this criticism.
Yeah. It's the same with so many things when it comes to politics in this country. And I think it's a real Achilles heel, actually, of progressives and the left. The BBC can't do any wrong. And I think it's an inbuilt weakness of any public service broadcaster when you have a huge amount of market share, you're trying to represent everybody and the institutions of the state, and that those two things can never disagree. The civil society and the institutions of the state can't disagree. Clearly they are. That's how change happens. And I think progressives are sleeping on it. Final question. So somebody could have watched all of this and they might think, this Graham chap's rather smart. I quite like Republic. I'll get in touch with them. I might set up a direct debit, follow them on Twitter. I like the arguments. You've convinced me. But look, the alternative is President Blair. What do you say to them?
Well, I mean, certainly I wouldn't be President Blair. I've met one person in my whole life that would want him to be president. It wasn't Tony Blair, but the alternative, firstly, is the implication behind that is, America, France, something like that. And that's not what anybody is talking about. We're talking about taking a parliamentary democracy, which is sort of what we have now, not quite, but sort of, and making it genuinely democratic. So you have a written constitution which just sets down the fundamental sort of building blocks and principles. You have a fully elected parliament. You still have a prime minister in the lower house. The upper house has some degree of, sort of power to be a check and balance. And you have an elected head of state who is primarily an ambassador and a representative, but who has very limited constitutional reserve powers, who is elected by all of us. Now, they do this successfully in Ireland, in Iceland, indirectly elected in Germany, in the Baltic states. They've just done it in Austria. There's this very popular new president. They do it in places like Italy and Greece as well, which have had all sorts of sort of political and economic problems over the last decade and a half, but their presidents have been quite useful in sort of keeping the ship of state afloat and keeping things going. So it's what we have, but democratic. And if you look at places like Ireland, for example, and Iceland and elsewhere, they not only are the systems good and more democratic, but they also elect some amazing heads of state, quite inspirational, interesting people. And I think that on that point alone, we would be spoiled for choice. And Blair wouldn't, come within a whisker of getting elected. He wouldn't even stand.
So more Ireland than France.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Ireland has come out of our same political tradition and they have created something which is better. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better. If you look at Michael D. Higgins, the current president of Ireland, he was a Labour politician. Labour in Ireland is quite a small party, but he was also a poet and an academic and an interesting thinker and very passionate on a whole host of social issues. And he has been hugely popular. And he was preceded by Mary McAleese, who was the second woman to be president of Ireland, but the first from Northern Ireland. Again, hugely popular. Mary Robinson was just before her in the 90s, first woman to be elected head of state. And her succession by Mary McAleese was the first time in the world, I think, that two women have succeeded one after another as head of state. Iceland has had some brilliant heads of state. There's a woman called Vigdis Finnbogadóttir, who was the president from 1980 to 1996. Again, largely a ceremonial role, but a powerful symbolic role. And she was the first woman ever in the whole world to be elected as president, as head of state. Had a huge sort of social and cultural impact, particularly for women's rights and equality, gender equality. Joachim Gauck was the president just before the current one in Germany, who was previously a pro-democracy campaigner in East Germany and became head of the Stasi records in Germany after unification and was hugely popular. another excellent German president was Richard von Weizsäcker, who made some pretty inspiring speeches in the 80s about how Germany deals with its past. You have Tarja Halonen in Finland, first woman to be president of Finland, who was, again, hugely popular. I mean, some of these people get popularity ratings in the 80s and 90s, and they're elected. And this guy that's just been elected in Austria, he seems pretty popular. He won, I think, close to 60% of the vote. For all the talk about, his influence on things like their approach to the war and so on, in Ukraine, I mean, it's a post with relatively limited power. It's the prime minister that runs the government. Yeah. But, these are people who do a similar job to the monarch in this country, but they have accountability if they get it wrong. They have a mandate if they need to use any of their limited power. And they also have constitutions which are there for them to guard and protect. So in Ireland, for example, if Parliament passes a law which the President believes is unconstitutional, they can refer it to the court to be adjudicated on. Whereas here, our government can pass whatever law it likes, doesn't matter how awful it is, how many rights it attacks, whether we, banning protests and stripping people of the right to strike and, whatever it likes. There's almost no limit on the power of government. So long as they have an acquiescent backbench, and can often use Privy Council powers, Crown powers as well, outside of the Parliament, and the monarch will do absolutely nothing to protect us against the government. So, yeah, the alternative is fairly simple, very democratic, but in the wider sort of longer term, it's quite powerful as well.
That's a very compelling argument, Graham. And if people want to stay in touch with your work and find out more about what you do, how can they do that?
Well, republic.org.uk is the website. It's pretty simple. So yeah, it's Republic. We do what it says on the tin. We are a single issue campaign, and we have been growing enormously. So we're looking for a big protest, hundreds of people at the coronation. We've grown enormously over the last 2 years. All these big stories help us. So yeah, get involved. And the good thing about being a citizen instead of a subject is it's the difference between being a participant and a spectator. And the same with campaigning and being a Republican. You'll get it if you get involved and work for it.
Graham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.